Lesson 9 is mergers, acquisitions, and hostile takeovers. This is where two companies merge into one company takes over another company, whether voluntarily or, believe it or not, involuntarily. So a merger is simply two or more corporations combining to form into one single corporation. When AOL and Time Warner merged and became AOL Time Warner, that was a merger. An acquisition is when one company buys out another company so that only one company now exists. When Facebook purchased WhatsApp, well, the whole thing became part of Facebook, although the app is still called WhatsApp, but still that was an acquisition. The difference is really just a formality. The only one major difference is that when you're talking about a merger, in other words, both of them essentially don't survive, become one hybrid company, the shareholders of both companies have to approve before the merger is actually done, whereas in an acquisition, when one company is taking over another company, the buying company doesn't need to put it to a shareholder vote, but the recipient company, the selling company, the company that is going to no longer exist, does need to put it to a shareholder vote in order for it to be allowed. A short form merger, on the other hand, which doesn't require the approval of either company in terms of its shareholders, obviously the management has to consent to it, is when one company that already owned a lot of another company, that already owned, let's say, 80 or 90% of the subsidiary company, just takes it over entirely. That is called a short form merger. In these cases, and whether we're talking, and this is a short form merger or a merger or an acquisition, the company that is surviving, whichever company that is, the purchasing company, the new company in a merger, the parent company in a short form merger, the parent company takes all the debts, rights, and responsibilities and obligations of both companies. In other words, if there's a merger, then whatever contracts each company had now become the sole responsibility of the surviving company. Other important things regarding corporations include something like a share exchange. A share exchange is a method by which companies are very often paid for. If Facebook wants to buy WhatsApp, for example, for $19 billion, well, people don't usually have $19 billion in cash. Even companies, even major companies, don't usually have $19 billion in cash. Apple might be one exception, but virtually all companies in the world don't have that kind of cash. When there's a merger and a company needs billions of dollars, it doesn't usually go to the bank and or write a check or anything like that. Instead, the way it pays for the new company is it gives the old shareholders, the shareholders of the old company, stock in the new company. For example, if WhatsApp was, let's say, was being bought for $19 billion, what Facebook did, I'm sure, is it gave the owners of WhatsApp $19 billion worth of Facebook stock. They didn't actually give $19 billion in cash. If they're both publicly held companies, if, when American Airlines and US Air merged, or when two other big companies merge, rather than the individual shareholders of each company getting cash for whatever stock is being purchased by the parent company, instead they get stock in the new company. People who own stock in US Airways instead just got American Airlines shares that were worth the amount of whatever the purchase was. Dissolution, on the other hand, is when a company simply stops operating. If the company does stop operating, any kind of a company, publicly held or not, does stop operating, so whatever is left, whatever assets there are, that could be inventory, it could be goodwill, it could be intellectual property, it could be pretty much anything, is used to pay whatever creditors, and the rest, if there are and if there is any money left over, then those are used as dividends, as dissolution dividends. Dissolution dividends are dividends that are paid off to the shareholders after the company stops operating. A consolidation, very similar to a merger, occurs when two or more corporations combine to form an entirely new corporation. And in this case, the articles of incorporation of the new corporation replace the articles of incorporation of the two old corporations. Essentially, a merger and a consolidation are pretty much the same thing. And as we discussed before, an ordinary merger or a share exchange requires the vote of both sets of shareholders. It requires originally the recommendation of the board of directors of each company because any major company, any major undertaking of a company first is going to be decided by the board of directors, and the board of directors will make a recommendation to the shareholders to adopt it. But the shareholders have to vote by majority vote, and usually this is done through a process of proxy system where voters don't actually come and vote particularly, but they give people their proxies to vote to uphold to approve the merger, let's say. And when that happens, then the acquisition or the merger, the consolidation, whatever it is, can take place. So you need the affirmative vote, yes vote, in other words, of the majority of the shares of the new corporation. If the merger is approved, or if the consolidation is approved, so the articles of merger or the share exchange are filed with the Secretary of State, and now instead of two corporations of that state, it is now one corporation of that state. There's also the purchase of all assets. The purchase of all assets occurs when a company, instead of merging and buying the company, instead of actually purchasing the company itself, it simply purchases the company's assets, purchase the company's inventory. If I want to buy an airline, for example, I can buy the airline, or I can buy all of the airline's airplanes, and all of the airline's pilot contracts, and all of the airline's airport slots, and whatever other assets there are, instead of actually buying the company. Now, the advantage of this is that you don't have to take on the contracts. If there's an airline that has all sorts of debts, well, if I buy the airline, I'm going to take on those debts. But on the other hand, if I just buy the airplanes and I just buy the airport port slots or the fuel or the hangars or whatever else the airline owes, well, then I'm not buying the whole company, and therefore I'm not buying the debt as well. Now, a court can look at a transaction and say this was really a merger, and you're just phrasing it as a purchase of assets in order to avoid taking on the debts. And in that case, the court can actually say this is more like a merger and we're going to hold you liable for debts. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes if you have a company that has a lot of debts or has bad contracts, you may just want to buy their assets rather than buying the entire company.